Clint Eastwood stepped onto the stage at Lone Star Arena in Dallas, Texas. No introduction, no fanfare, just him and a silence so heavy it felt sacred. The light sliced through the stillness, casting a silver glow on his weathered gray suit. His hair was white now, his eyes sharp and cold as steel, and his face unreadable. The face of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Just 3 minutes earlier, Robert Dairo, two-time Oscar winner, loud, polished, and hungry, had walked out under those same lights and stared straight into the camera with a smirk. Clint Eastwood is the voice of a dead America, he declared, a relic in cowboy boots clinging to a past no one cares about. The crowd went wild. Cheers, boos, whistles, laughter. Half the room applauded like it was gospel. The other half held their breath, eyes locked on the man in the shadows. And Clint, he didn't move. He stood there like time had stopped around him as the room belonged to him. And he just didn't know it yet. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to win a debate. He was here because sometimes silence becomes a crime when lies get applause. This wasn't just a talk show segment. This was a showdown between two icons, two eras, between Hollywood noise and old school truth. On one side stood Robert Dairo, sharp suit, a sharper tongue, always performing. On the other stood Clint Eastwood, silent, steady, and lethal, in the way only a man who doesn't need to prove anything can be. And later, when asked what he thought of it all, Clint would say 7 words that echoed louder than any speech. You came to perform, I came to end the show. No introductions. There are no opening lines, just two men, one chasing the spotlight, the other is ready to shut it off. The lights dimmed enough to sharpen the contrast as Robert Dairo stepped to center stage. His black suit fit like armor, tailored, intentional, flawless. Every seam screamed presence. He didn't just walk in. He arrived like a storm in tailored silk, with 2 Oscars under his belt and a legacy built on mobsters, anti-heroes, and blurred lines of morality. Dairo moved like a man who had survived the fires of Hollywood and emerged flameproof. But tonight, he wasn't here to talk. He was here to bury a legend. He grabbed the microphone like an old friend, flipped it upright with the confidence of a Broadway star, locked eyes with Clint Eastwood, and slowly scanned the room like a general claiming the battlefield. Let's stop pretending, he began, his thick New York accent slicing through the room like a butcher's blade. Clint Eastwood isn't a hero. He's a symbol of a version of America that should have been left behind long ago. A sound wave rippled through the studio. Gasps, claps, tension. Cheers echoed from the left. From the right, dead silence. In the back, a few boos cut through the noise, sharp, unsure. Some applauded. Others folded their arms like they'd been insulted in their homes. This man talks about grit and values like he invented them. Dairo sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. But where was he when the country was burning? When we were marching, speaking out, risking careers, reputations, and lives? He was on some quiet ranch in Carmel, watching the fire from a safe distance. A smattering of applause came from the front row. A middle-aged man in a veteran's cap crossed his arms and didn't blink. A college student held up his phone, already live streaming. Jack Reeves, the host, glanced off camera like he was waiting for a cue to step in, but stayed frozen. Dairo began to pace, slow, measured, like a prosecutor circling a guilty witness. He hasn't made a great movie in years, he snapped. He thinks a scowl is wisdom. He walks in here like the ghost of John Wayne. But all I see is a man too afraid to accept the future. The left side of the room erupted. Applause, whistles. Someone shouted, "Say it louder." Phones lit up. Tweets flew. Within seconds, the hashtag #dead cowboy was already picking up speed. Darl turned back to Clint and raised a finger. Not to the crowd, but to Eastwood himself. You call it loyalty. I call it stubborn pride. You talk about truth like it's your inheritance. But the truth, Mr. Eastwood, is that you're no longer the people's voice. You're just the echo of a world that forgot how to change. That's when the pushback began. From the right, a man in row 4 shouted, "Let him speak." Another, "He's earned his place, Dairo." A woman near the aisle muttered, "He's not a relic. He's real." But Dairo didn't flinch. He smirked, his eyes gleaming with something darker than confidence, something like hunger. He was chasing blood. Now, you want to defend this country? Fine. But don't pretend that staying silent is some kind of virtue. You stayed quiet for too long, and now you want to show up and play savior. He paused. He lifted both arms wide like bowing on a Broadway stage, a showman in full flight. He's not here for truth. He's here because he misses the applause. Then just for a second, a flicker. He looked toward Clint, and the smirk twitched. Maybe it was the way Clint stood, still as stone, eyes steady, jaw set. Maybe it was the crowd, not roaring anymore, but holding its breath. Or maybe it was something more profound, a brief realization that he may have gone too far. But Daryl shook it off. He went for the kill. So go ahead, Mr. Cowboy. Say your piece. Let's see if the myth can survive the moment. The room cracked open. There were roars, shouts, applause, and jeers. The energy was electric, divided, on edge, impossible to contain. A nation in miniature, split down the middle. And in the eye of that storm, unmoving, unshaken, stood Clint Eastwood. Not blinking, not biting, just waiting. Clint Eastwood didn't speak right away. He leaned forward slowly, placing both hands on the table before him like a gunslinger resting before the final draw. The room quieted. Even the air seemed to wait. And then he looked up. "You said I missed the applause," he said, voice low, graveled, cutting. "Son, I've walked away from more standing ovations than you've ever earned." A pause, the crowd stirred. "I didn't come here for claps. I came here because men like you talk too damn much and remember too little." He turned slightly, eyes locking with Dario's. "You stand on this stage pretending to speak for the future, but all I hear is ego, dressed up as progress." Then he leaned back just a little, voice calm and precise. "Let's rewind the tape, Bob. Back before hashtags, before the outrage, back when truth didn't need applause, and neither did you." Clint raised one hand and motioned toward the production crew. A screen behind him lit up. The grainy timestamp read 2009. It was Robert Dairo sitting in a CNN interview. His hair was darker, his tone warm. "I think Clint Eastwood represents something rare in Hollywood. Quiet, decent, real leadership." The clip paused, frozen silence. Clint turned back to Dairo, his tone now razor sharp. "That was you, Bob. That was before you started playing activist more than actor. Before applause started mattering more than truth." A low rumble passed through the audience. Phones shot up again. The tide was shifting. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You call me the past. I've seen this country at war, at peace, in pieces. I've worked with kids who bled out in jungles, not actors who melt in Twitter fights." "You say I stayed quiet too long?" "No, Bob. I listened. That's something this country forgot how to do." Clint stepped closer to the table, eyes still locked on Dairo. "You want to stand there and throw dirt? Fine, but don't forget who planted the ground you're standing on." The conservative side erupted. Even a few neutral heads began nodding. Dairo's smirk faltered just for a second, and then Clint delivered the final blow. "You called me a ghost, but ghosts don't come back to talk. They come back to haunt." The room froze, then exploded. Applause, whistles, shock. Even Jack Reeves, the host, blinked, leaned into his mic and whispered, "Well, the cow's not dead yet." Dairo tried to speak, but the crowd wasn't listening. Not anymore, because Clint Eastwood had spoken. And when he speaks, even time stops to listen. Robert Dairo was still standing, but now he was breathing harder. The fire from earlier, the swagger, the certainty had faded just enough to notice. He pointed a finger at Clint, but it lacked the edge. The tone in his voice had shifted. Frustration, yes, but behind it, something quieter, something closer to fear. "You think you're clever?" he snapped, the words cutting sharper than they should have. "You sit there like some prophet on a rocking chair and think your silence makes you deep." The crowd stirred, but not with cheers. This wasn't the same energy from earlier. It was skeptical now, measured. Some laughed, not full-bodied laughs, but small, tight ones. Others didn't move at all. They weren't listening to Dairo anymore. They were watching. Clint waiting, not for a response, for a reckoning. And then he moved. Clint leaned forward, slow and deliberate. The leather of his chair creaked just once. But that sound alone pulled the entire room tighter. It spoke louder than the mic. It's noisier than Dairo. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. I didn't come here to be clever, Clint said, voice steady as granite. I came here because men like you keep talking until the truth gets buried under applause. Darl scoffed and folded his arms like a defense mechanism, but even that looked forced. Clint didn't blink. His voice remained level, but every word landed like a slow-moving hammer. You mock what you don't understand. You think strength is who yells the loudest, but real strength, real damn strength is knowing when to speak and what not to say. He stood, not fast, not dramatic, just steady, like a man who'd carried the weight of his words long before the lights ever turned on. You've had your stage, you had your fans, your movies, your moments. He paused just long enough for the silence to thicken. Then he turned, not to Dairo, but to the cameras in the country watching beyond them. But I ain't here for a standing ovation. I'm here because I see a country that claps for performance and forgets how to listen to the truth. Silence. Heavy. Total. He turned back to Dairo, locking eyes. You called me outdated, but maybe what's outdated is mistaking noise for wisdom. It hit like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Even the cameras seemed to move slower, as if they too were trying to savor the moment. Even the air paused just for him. Daryl froze. No comeback, no clever remark, no smirk, just the sound of breath, and Clint's words still hanging like smoke in a chapel. Clint walked back to his chair, but he didn't sit. He didn't look back. He just stood there like a man who didn't need to win because he'd already ended the game. From near the second row, a woman covered her mouth with both hands, eyes glassy. A tear rolled down her cheek. She whispered to the man beside her, almost inaudible, "He's right." A veteran 2 rows behind her bowed his head. Someone in the far back whispered, "That's not a line. That's a lesson." And then finally Jack Reeves, the host, leaned into his mic, his voice almost reverent. Well, if that ain't the cleanest cut I've seen on this stage. The crowd couldn't hold it any longer. Applause, whistles, shouts. It wasn't a reaction, it was a release. But it wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about sides. It was about presence. It's about something old and unshakable. A voice from the shadows called out above the roar. That's why he's Clint Eastwood. Even Robert Dairo didn't argue. The studio lights faded, but the tension didn't. Backstage, Clint Eastwood stood alone behind the curtain. No entourage, no fist pumps, no celebratory grin. Just him adjusting his coat sleeve like the moment on stage meant nothing. Or maybe everything. Meanwhile, under the lingering heat of the stage lights, Robert Dairo sat frozen in his chair, his face flushed, his hands once dominant, expressive, theatrical, now trembled slightly. He hadn't expected this. Not from Clint Eastwood, the man he'd called outdated. But tonight, Clint hadn't just shown up. He had shifted the entire room without moving much at all. And in less than 5 minutes, the internet would catch fire. Moments after the broadcast ended, Western Liberty Media posted a 40-second clip. No editing, no commentary, just the shot. Clint under the lights, still standing, delivering that final razor-edged line. What's outdated is mistaking noise for wisdom. No music, no sound effects, just the weight of the words. It hit like thunder. Within 4 minutes, the hashtag Eastwood Silence Cuts Deeper was trending nationwide. Conservative pages reposted it instantly. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. Clint just ended a Hollywood legend when with one line. But it wasn't just conservatives. Even neutral voices and longtime critics began sharing it. I don't care what side you're on. That was power, not a sound. No anger, just dignity. That's what we're missing in this country. Memes followed fast. One showed Dairo slouched in his chair, red-faced, captioned, "When you try to cancel Clint and he cancels the entire room." Another Clint is under the spotlight, arms by his side with a calm expression. The caption, "Legends don't yell, they wait." Jack Reeves, the host, posted a behind-the-scenes photo. It showed Clint walking alone down a dim hallway, just a silhouette fading into shadow. His caption, "I've hosted for 20 years. Never seen a takedown that quiet and that devastating." But the most quietly decisive moment didn't happen online. It happened just before Clint, a young stagehand, maybe 19, barely old enough to know Clint from reruns, caught up to him near the exit. "Mr. Eastwood," he said softly, almost nervous. "That was something else." Clint looked at him and nodded once. Then he said without breaking stride, "Don't follow the noise, kid. Follow the weight." And then he disappeared into the night. As for Dairo, he left the studio late, surrounded by tense staff, no press stop, no interviews, just a single tweet the next morning. "Clint's a good actor, but the world still needs voices that speak up for truth." The top reply, "He did speak. You just couldn't handle it." There was no screaming, no insults, no spectacle, just a few sentences, sharp, heavy, final. In less than 24 hours, Clint Eastwood went from being labeled a relic to become a new symbol of timeless strength. Not because he fought harder, but because he stood still and spoke with the truth. The dust had barely settled, but the ripple effects had already begun. Political pundits jumped in. Right-wing outlets hailed Clint Eastwood as the voice of real American grit. Left-leaning commentators dismissed it as a well-timed media stunt from a retired actor. But beneath the noise, something deeper had shifted. This wasn't just a viral moment, it was a reminder. Stillness still holds power in a world drowning in outrage, spin, and sound bites. Within days, Clint Eastwood's name surged in search trends. News networks replayed the showdown. Talk radio hosts dissected every sentence. And behind closed doors, political strategists, Republican and independent alike, admitted the truth. He didn't just win the moment. He reshaped the battlefield. For Robert Dairo, the fallout was undeniable. The once defiant voice of Hollywood now sounded dulled. His interviews lost their edge. His statements felt rehearsed, hollow. He wasn't seen as a fighter, just a man who had taken a hit and never stood back up. Even longtime fans began to waver. He looked more like a character chasing relevance, one said, than a man standing for anything real. Meanwhile, Clint didn't bask in the moment. No victory lap, no interviews, no tweets, just a quiet quote in a small California paper. "I've said my piece. I've always believed a man should speak only when it matters. And maybe that's why it mattered. Because in a culture addicted to constant commentary, Clint Eastwood didn't shout above the chaos. He waited until the noise burned itself out and then spoke with purpose. It wasn't about left or right. It wasn't about trending hashtags. It was about who stood taller when the lights hit and who stood for something when it counted. The impact wasn't just political, it was personal. It made millions stop and ask, am I listening for truth or just looking for someone who sounds like me? And it wasn't just the older generation who felt it. A 22-year-old podcaster tweeted, "I didn't grow up with Clint Eastwood movies, but last night I saw what real strength looks like, and it wasn't yelling." In that silence, in that one calm moment on stage, Clint Eastwood didn't just win an argument. He reminded America of who it used to be and who it might still become. In a world where everyone's racing to speak louder, Clint Eastwood reminded us that sometimes the quietest voice hits the hardest. He didn't come back to clap back. He didn't come to trend. He came to remind America of what respect, restraint, and real strength used to look like. No shouting, no anger, just presence. He stood his ground, calm, focused, and proved one truth. You don't have to yell to stand tall, and maybe that's the lesson we're meant to carry forward. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about Hollywood. It was about character, the kind that speaks less but means more. So let us ask you, have you ever been underestimated, judged by your silence, age, or past? Have you ever had to prove that stillness isn't a weakness? Waiting, listening, and standing steady take more strength than shouting ever could. If this story hits something real in you, tell us. Drop a comment, share your moment, and let's remind each other and this generation that character still matters. Because in the end, it's not the loudest voice that echoes the longest, it's the truest one. This was Hidden Story America. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.